London, 1883. Rain hammers the Strand, a carriage shatters the night. An orphaned seamstress drags a child to safety, then meets the widowed duke whose gaze can't forget her. Whispers ignite like kindling. Was it fate, or the first crack in a carefully guarded life? In a house draped in mourning, a locked ledger waits, a river gate remembers, and a past refuses to stay buried. Duty says distance, desire says one more breath, one more page, one more step toward the truth. Tonight begins a story of quiet courage, dangerous tenderness, and a choice that will cost everything. Tell us where you're listening from, and answer this. In period romances, do you treasure duty or desire? London, in the waning weeks of November 1883, was a city of veiled glances, soot-streaked skies, and stories written in fog. The gas lamps lining the Strand flickered beneath the weight of an insistent rain, casting long golden bars upon the cobblestones. Carriages hissed through puddles like ghosts at war with time, and the cries of paper boys vanished into the clamour of hooves and umbrellas snapping against the wind. Among the crowd, with her chin tucked beneath the edge of her woolen hood and her skirts heavy with rain, walked Emilia Marlowe. She carried no parasol, only a cloth bundle pressed to her chest, wrapped in oilskin and tied with twine. Inside it, 3 new collars for Mr. Greeley's shop, a bit of supper wrapped in waxed paper, and a threadbare book of poems borrowed and reread to near ruin. Her boots, scuffed at the toes, split along the seams, had long surrendered to the water beneath them, but Emilia walked as she always did, with quiet purpose and the softness of someone used to moving unnoticed. She had not come to the Strand for heroics. She had merely wanted to cut through the square before the rain turned sleet. But fate, like the city itself, had its own tempo. The crash came not with a scream, but with the shatter of iron against stone, the brittle cry of startled horses, and a wheel bouncing loose into the gutter. A black carriage lay sideways at the curb, one door ripped from its hinge, the other hanging crooked like a broken jaw. A horse still in harness struggled on its side, hooves kicking into nothing. A crowd began to gather. Some gasped, others pointed. No one moved. Emilia did. Her bundle fell to the street with a soft slap, forgotten. She lifted her skirts and ran. Her hands, calloused, pale, stained faintly with ink, reached for the carriage door just as a cry pierced the air. A child's cry. She pushed past a frozen valet and ducked into the carriage, the scent of blood and smoke and soaked velvet rushing to meet her. Inside, beneath a tangle of travelling blankets and glass, sat a little girl of perhaps 6 years. Blonde hair matted with rain, eyes wide and unfocused, her lips pressed shut against a scream she did not yet understand how to release. "It's all right," Emilia murmured, her voice steady, maternal. "You're not alone." She reached for the girl and with careful arms drew her out. The child clung to her, silent but shivering, and buried her face into Emilia's soaked collar. As the crowd stepped back, Emilia turned to re-enter the wreckage. A man was still inside. He sat slumped against the far wall of the carriage, his waistcoat dark with blood at the shoulder, his cravat undone, his eyes half-lidded with pain, and something deeper, grief perhaps, or the stunned weight of survival. His left hand gripped the seat, his right cradled his injured arm, but he looked not at his wound, nor at the wreckage. He looked at Emilia, and she, in that rain-slicked moment, forgot to breathe. He was older than her, perhaps by 15 years. His features were sharp, noble but worn, his skin pale, his jaw dusted with stubble, his dark hair streaked with silver at the temples. There was something ancient in his gaze, like a man who had seen the edge of every joy, and now stood watch over its grave. "Is she harmed?" he asked, his voice low, ragged. "No," Emilia said softly, adjusting the child in her arms. "She's frightened but whole." His eyes, hazel though ringed in storm, shuttered in relief. He tried to rise but gasped and faltered. Without asking, Emilia stepped forward. "Don't move," she said. You'll tear the muscle clean through. Let me help." She reached for him, her hand steady, though her heart pounded like thunder behind her ribs. Their fingers brushed, roughened seamstress skin against aristocratic bone, and for a fraction of a second, something passed between them. Not recognition, not even understanding, but a spark, sharp and invisible, that cut through propriety like lightning through fog. She helped him from the carriage. A doctor was called. A name was spoken. "The Duke of Renthorpe," someone whispered. "That's the widowed one, the reclusive one." Gasps rippled through the crowd as the truth spread. And then, "Who is the girl? Did you see her touch his hand?" "A seamstress," someone said. "Lord, what a scene!" Emilia did not hear them. She was too busy holding the child, too focused on the man's injury, too wet and cold and stunned to realize her world had already tilted. By the time the physician arrived, she had vanished. The Duke would be tended. The child returned to her nursery. The newspapers would write clever headlines the next morning, but Emilia Marlowe, soaked to the skin and clutching a bundle ruined by rain, walked home through narrow lanes and brick alleys, unaware that London would soon learn her name, and that everything she believed about silence, service, and the place of a seamstress in a duke's world was about to be rewritten, not with ink or thread, but with the trembling weight of a gaze that refused to forget hers. The letter arrived on cream-coloured stationery, pressed with the seal of the House of Renthorpe, and folded with a precision that seemed to weigh more than mere words ever should. Emilia Marlowe held it in her trembling hands, her fingers still damp from the morning's washing, the scent of lye and damp linen clinging to her wrists. Her aunt's sharp voice sliced through the silence. "What nonsense is that now?" Emilia said nothing. She read the letter again, even though the words were already etched into her memory. "Miss Marlowe, His Grace, the Duke of Renthorpe, extends his gratitude for your assistance last Tuesday and invites you to consider a temporary engagement as private reader to his daughter, Lady Margaret Blackthorne. Remuneration shall be generous, lodging provided, discretion above all is expected. Yours faithfully, Bernard Felton, Solicitor to His Grace." Emilia folded the letter with care, pressing her thumb to the raised wax emblem. A blackthorn branch surrounded by a circle of Latin text she could not read but somehow understood. It was not a request. It was an opening, a door she had never imagined would swing her way. Her aunt, round-faced and red from soap fumes, continued grumbling as she kneaded bread at the table. "They'll eat you alive, those people. You'll be nothing more than a pet curiosity until they tire of you." Emilia did not reply. The words did not wound. She had grown beneath their shadow. What stirred inside her was something older and quieter, not ambition, not even defiance, just the sense that, for once, life was listening. 3 days later, Emilia stood before the iron gates of Renthorpe House, her worn satchel clutched to her side, her cloak buttoned high against the wind. Behind the gates, the mansion rose like a dream preserved in stone, 4 stories of pale Portland stone streaked with ivy, its tall windows shaded by green velvet drapes. The gravel drive curved like an elegant question mark around a circular fountain, now drained for winter, its statues weeping algae instead of water. She was shown in by a footman whose silence matched the hush that hung over the house. The marble floor gleamed like frost. Gilded mirrors flanked every corridor, and the scent of lavender polish mingled with something more spectral. Old roses and old grief. Paintings of past dukes lined the hall, their eyes solemn and accusing. In the drawing room, Mrs. Havers awaited. The housekeeper stood tall and straight in her charcoal wool dress, her white collar stiff as her spine, her eyes black as coal and just as soft. "You'll report to the nursery at 9:30, she said without preamble. "Meals are taken below stairs. The girl does not speak, but she hears well. Do not shout, do not overstep, and you will keep to your place, Miss Marlowe." "I understand," Emilia replied, but the truth was, she didn't, not until she met Margaret. The nursery was not what Emilia had imagined. There were no bright ribbons, no scatter of toys, only a tall window framed in heavy drapes, a rocking horse long abandoned in one corner, and a shelf of untouched books. The room felt like a heart that had learned not to beat too loudly. Margaret sat by the window, her knees drawn up to her chest, her honey-blonde hair loosely braided down her back. She turned as Emilia entered, but said nothing. Her eyes, hazel with flecks of green, were too large for her small, pale face, and her silence pressed more than her presence. It was not emptiness. It was locked doors behind her gaze. Emilia did not try to speak. She removed her cloak and sat on the low chair beside the child, opened the book she had brought, a worn volume of Grimm's Tales, and began to read. Her voice was low, unrushed, as though the story was unfolding not on the page, but in the very air between them. Margaret did not move, but she listened. Each day unfolded in gentle repetition. Emilia read, Margaret listened. Occasionally she would reach for a page and turn it, or place a hand lightly on a particular illustration. A tower, a path through woods, a golden-haired girl looking back. She did not speak, but she was present. The rest of the house remained silent in its own language. Footmen drifted like ghosts. Candles were always half lit. Mrs. Havers observed everything with the detachment of a general guarding a ruined palace. Emilia ate her meals alone in a small servants' parlour, seated beside the kitchen maid who never smiled, and the butler who spoke only when spoken to. It was not unkindness. It was distance, carefully measured. And then he returned, the Duke. Adrian Blackthorne descended the grand staircase 3 days after Emilia's arrival. She saw him only briefly at first, passing through the hall, his coat dark as coal, his eyes unreadable beneath the shadow of his hat. But later that afternoon, as Emilia read aloud from the Water Babies, she sensed a presence at the nursery door. He stood there, silent, watching. She faltered in her reading, unsure whether to rise or remain seated. But Margaret, her fingers clutching the fabric of Emilia's skirt, did not move. So Emilia continued. Her voice remained low and clear, her hands turning the pages with deliberate grace. Adrian did not speak. He merely nodded once, barely perceptible, and disappeared down the corridor. The next day he returned, and the next. He never entered, never interrupted. But Emilia began to feel the change in the room. The air grew warmer. Margaret shifted closer. One afternoon, she brought a pencil and sheet of paper and began to draw shaky lines that formed trees, a house, a gate, a gate. Later that evening, Emilia wandered into the back corridor and paused before a tall arched window overlooking the garden. The iron gate that separated the estate from the river beyond lay rusted but closed. The river ran black in the distance, its banks lined with twisted brambles. She watched it for a long time, then turned away. That night, as she prepared for bed in her attic chamber beneath the eaves, she removed her hairpins and sat before the small mirror with the silvered glass. The day clung to her in strange ways. The sound of Margaret's breath as she leaned in to see the words, the glimpse of the Duke's figure outlined in the doorway, the soft friction of her own heartbeat whenever silence fell too long. She did not know what she was becoming to this house. Not quite servant, not quite guest, something in between, something unspeakable. And yet she stayed, because Margaret had looked at her, because the Duke had listened. Because something unnamed had awakened in the stillness. Renthorpe House had not changed. The drapes remained drawn. The candles still flickered low. But within its silence, something had shifted, and Emilia Marlowe, with her quiet voice and ink-stained hands, had begun, gently, invisibly, to stitch it back together. The mornings at Renthorpe House began not with bells or bustle, but with silence. A silence so complete it pressed against the windows like fog. It moved through the hallways, past the oil paintings of forgotten ancestors, down the velveted staircases and into the cold breath of the nursery, where a child no longer wept and a seamstress no longer questioned why she had come. Every day, at precisely 9:30, Emilia entered with a book cradled in her arms and a softness in her voice that had not been learned, but born of necessity, shaped by years of saying little and meaning much. She would sit beside Lady Margaret's chair, never too close, never too far, and begin reading in tones low and melodic, letting the rhythm of each word fold itself gently into the stillness of the room. The child did not speak, but she listened. Her small fingers often curled around the edge of her wool dress or twisted a ribbon sewn onto her sleeve. Her gaze, wide and too knowing for 6 years, would fix itself on the pages as if searching for something between the lines, something no one else could see. Emilia began with fairy tales, but not the ones gilded with sweetness. She chose the darker ones, the fables with crooked truths and uncomfortable endings, the ones where wolves spoke in riddles and queens hid sorrow behind silk veils. These stories made Margaret blink. Once when reading a tale about a princess locked in a tower who refused to scream, Emilia paused. She wasn't afraid, she said softly, watching the child. She was waiting for someone who would listen. Margaret's hand stilled on her dress. It was in those moments, those fragile in-betweens, where silence cracked slightly at the edges, that Emilia began to understand the house, or rather, what the house refused to say. The way the wind coiled down the chimneys like a whisper, the faint smell of roses in rooms where no fresh flowers had been placed, the distant sound of piano notes echoing down hallways though no music had been played in over a year. Renthorpe was not haunted by spirits, not truly, but it was heavy with grief, and grief had its own way of moving through walls, of tucking itself into the corners of drapery and the underside of staircases. It was also, Emilia discovered, filled with secrets. One afternoon, as she descended to the small library in search of another volume for the day's reading, she found a locked door slightly ajar. A study, long unused, the hearth cold, the desk cluttered not with ink and parchment, but with dust-covered books and a pile of unsorted correspondence. Among them, half buried, lay a leather-bound ledger, the binding worn, the pages yellowed at the edges. She should not have opened it, but something called her hand. The name Eliza Blackthorne was inscribed inside the front cover in faded ink, the late Duchess. The entries were precise, written in a slanted hand, expenses, charitable donations, names of tenant families she had supported. Then, abruptly, midway through the book, the entries stopped. Several pages had been torn out, not neatly, but with a rip born of haste. Emilia returned the ledger carefully to its place, her pulse quickening. She told herself she had imagined it, that there were reasons for everything, a family mourning, a household rearranged. And yet, she could not shake the feeling of something lost, something buried. That same evening, as she crossed the main corridor with the book pressed to her chest, she felt the unmistakable weight of a gaze. The Duke stood near the window, half shrouded by the heavy green curtains. His posture was straight, his hands clasped behind his back, his expression unreadable. For a moment neither moved. Then he spoke, not as a nobleman to a servant, not even as a father to a governess. "Do you always read aloud that way?" he asked. She hesitated. "Only when someone is listening." A ghost of a smile passed across his lips. "Margaret listens more than most." He stepped forward, the candlelight warming the hollows of his face, softening the edges sharpened by solitude. "You choose unusual stories. I choose the ones that survive." Their eyes met, and Emilia felt something shift, something not romantic, not yet, but aching with possibility, as if both recognized in the other a soul accustomed to weathering storms. He said nothing more, only nodded once, then turned and walked away. From that day forward, Emilia began to notice his presence more often. Outside the nursery, passing by the garden where she sometimes took Margaret for a brief walk, standing beneath the gallery's archway where the late Duchess's portrait had once hung. He never lingered long, never asked questions, but he saw her, and others saw it too. The staff began to glance in her direction more than usual. A kitchen maid dropped her spoon when Emilia entered. The footman who opened doors now did so without eye contact. Mrs. Havers, though not unkind, grew cooler. In town it was worse. On her rare errands to the bookshop or the milliner's for her aunt, Emilia began to hear the whispers. "She's still there, you know, in that house. They say she reads to the child, but who reads to him? I saw her once. Plain little thing, but they say he watches her." Renthorpe's mourning had once earned it a shroud of reverence. Now it shimmered with gossip. The ghost of the Duchess was not spoken of with fear, but with suspicion. And Emilia became the shadow many feared to name. She could have left. She had every reason to. But every morning, Margaret waited for her at the window, one ribbon in her braid, her book already placed upon the chair. And every evening Emilia returned to her room and unpinned her hair in front of a cracked mirror, wondering if silence could be taught to speak. It was not love that kept her. Not yet. It was something older than love, and quieter, the knowledge that some wounds did not bleed, but echoed, and that sometimes all a soul needed was a voice willing to sit beside the silence and stay. And Emilia Marlowe, with her stories stitched in threadbare binding, and her heart folded carefully between sentences, stayed. The day Renthorpe House opened its doors again to society was grey and wind-blown, the kind of English afternoon where light filtered through clouds like a memory trying to return. The carriages arrived one by one, polished to gleam beneath the chill. Footmen stood like statues in livery too fine for their mood, and within the tall windows of the drawing-room, candles flickered against the pall of a house not yet done with mourning. Emilia stood at the edge of the preparations, her hands folded in front of her simple gown, her dark auburn hair pinned tightly beneath a modest cap. The gown, dusky blue wool with a scalloped collar and a row of buttons she had sewn herself, fit her like a second skin, unadorned and serviceable. It had taken her hours to press it, stitch the last seam, and polish her boots until they gleamed. Still, she felt as if she had dressed for a world that would never quite open its door to her. The gathering was not grand, a dozen guests at most, but they came dressed in the quiet extravagance of the upper class. Black silk gloves, brocade waistcoats, diamond pins passed from one generation to the next. They murmured greetings as they entered, their eyes sweeping the great hall not with reverence, but with curiosity. Renthorpe House had for too long kept its grief behind locked doors. Now they came to see what remained of the Duke and his daughter, and who stood beside them. Mrs. Havers introduced Emilia not as staff, but as Lady Margaret's private reader. The words hung in the air like an unspoken challenge. A seamstress, elevated by circumstance, a servant not quite in uniform. No one offered a reply. They simply looked. One woman, tall and powdered, with a neckline too low for the cold and a mouth set in perpetual dissatisfaction, smiled tightly and whispered behind her fan. She was introduced as Lady Eugenia Sinclair, cousin of the late Duchess. Her eyes lingered on Emilia a fraction too long before she turned to greet Adrian with an embrace too familiar and words too smooth. "She's young," someone murmured within earshot. "Bookish," said another. "Orphan, I heard, raised by tradesfolk." "She reads to the girl, not the Duke." "Not yet." The barbs were not shouted. They were dropped like lace gloves, soft and slow, and meant to sting long after the hand that cast them had vanished. Emilia stood near the sideboard, pretending to examine the tea service. Her face did not betray emotion, but her pulse trembled in her throat. Margaret clutched her hand with unexpected force. The child's other arm was looped through her father's, her grip protective rather than affectionate. She too had heard. When Adrian met Emilia's gaze from across the room, there was a moment, slender, quiet, where something passed between them. Not apology, not comfort, recognition. A shared knowledge of what it meant to live under the weight of other people's assumptions. Still, he said nothing, and that silence hurt more than words ever could. The evening crept forward with the elegance of discomfort. Tea was poured, a quartet played near the fireplace, the air smelled of lavender, old paper, and the discomfort of being observed. Emilia was not seated with the ladies. She stood behind Margaret's chair like a governess too cautious to pretend otherwise. And then Lady Eugenia turned, her smile bright with venom, her voice pitched to carry. "My dear Adrian, your little reader, what an unexpected addition to the household. Quite charming. It reminds me of those tales, you know, where orphans fill empty beds." The room fell silent. The fire snapped. Someone coughed politely. Adrian's jaw tightened. Emilia lowered her eyes, but not before the sting of humiliation seared her skin like frostbite. It was Margaret who moved first. The child stood. Not abruptly, but with a deliberate stillness that turned every head. She crossed the room without a sound, placed her small hand in Emilia's, and looked directly at her cousin. Then, as clear as morning breaking over frozen ground, she said, "Stay," one word, soft but certain. A voice returned after over a year of silence. Gasps rippled through the guests. Teacups froze mid-air. Mrs. Havers blinked, her stern hands stilling on a silver tray. The Duke looked at his daughter not with astonishment, but something deeper, something fragile and holy. Emilia knelt without thinking, her heart pounding so hard it drowned out everything else. "I'm here," she whispered. Margaret rested her forehead against Emilia's and closed her eyes. No one spoke for the rest of the evening. Not truly. Conversation resumed, but it was thin, strained, as if spoken in a house that no longer belonged to the people inside it. Later that night, when the guests had gone and the staff moved like shadows clearing plates and wax, Emilia wandered the corridor near the drawing room, her candle low, her steps careful. And she found him there. Adrian stood before the portrait. The Duchess of Renthorpe had been painted in a high-collared gown of sapphire velvet, her blonde hair coiled in ribbons, her eyes icy with distance. She looked down from her frame, like someone who had long ceased to belong in this world. Without a word, he reached up and removed the painting from its place. He did not look at Emilia as he set it aside, leaning it against the wall beneath a draped table. His fingers trembled slightly, but his posture remained regal. "She did not like this room," he said almost to himself. "She said it made her feel as though she were always being watched." Emilia swallowed, unsure if she was meant to answer. "I never understood what she meant," he continued, staring at the space now bare. "Until tonight." The silence between them was no longer empty. It was dense, brimming with the words neither dared speak. He turned to her at last. His face, lit only by the faint glow of the candle, was drawn but open. "I thank you," he said quietly, "for what you've given her." "I gave her nothing," Emilia replied. "She chose it, her voice, her moment." He studied her as if trying to read the spaces between her words. "She chose you," he said at last. And then he left her there, the candlelight casting shadows against the empty wall, the eyes of the portrait turned to face the floor. Emilia remained, her hand resting on the frame, her heart beating with something she did not yet dare to name. But in the hush of the house, beneath the hush of unsaid things, she felt it. Something had changed, and it could not be undone. The early December wind whispered through the tall trees of Renthorpe's gardens, brushing against the stone walls like the breath of something ancient and unsettled. Inside, the drawing room was lit with a modest fire, and Margaret sat on the rug by Emilia's feet, tracing the outline of a storybook illustration with a single finger. Her lips moved, forming silent words, each syllable resting gently on her tongue, as if reacquainting itself with the language of the living. Emilia turned a page slowly, her hand brushing lightly against the child's shoulder. The house felt quieter than usual, not in stillness, but in the way that follows a storm no one dares speak of. Mrs. Havers had left a stack of mending beside the parlour cabinet that morning, torn gloves, a coat with frayed lining, and beneath them a leather-bound book with its spine cracked and corner frayed. At first glance, it looked like a misplaced ledger, the sort of thing a housekeeper might use to track linen counts or coal orders. But it was not Mrs. Havers's handwriting that filled the pages. The ink was finer, the curves elegant but forceful. A woman's hand, a hand trained to command. Emilia recognized it at once. Eliza Blackthorne. The late Duchess's name was written in delicate script along the inside cover, along with the year, 1882. The ledger was meticulous. Donations to parish houses, payments for schooling to 2 daughters of a tenant farmer, contributions to a widows' society in St. Pancras. Each entry was dated, precise, and categorized. But midway through the volume, the entries changed. The writing became hurried, the figures no longer neat. A few sums were circled, some names underlined in red. A page had been torn out clean through the spine. Another had been folded sharply at the corner, as though someone had hesitated, then stopped altogether. The dates of these final entries sent a chill down Emilia's spine. The week the Duchess had died. She shut the book too quickly and stared at it on her lap. The fireplace crackled behind her, but its warmth no longer reached her skin. Something about the ledger felt like a locked room someone had dared open, and now she had stepped across the threshold. Emilia rose slowly, wrapped the book in a scarf, and tucked it beneath her shawl. She excused herself from Margaret, who watched her go with wide, silent eyes. It was not curiosity that carried Emilia down the corridor to the solicitor's study. It was duty, or something heavier, something threaded with instinct and ache. Mr. Felton, seated beneath a gas lamp with his spectacles low on his nose, looked up as she entered. He did not smile. He never did. She placed the book on the desk. "I found this in the mending," she said. "It belonged to the Duchess." He opened it with care, as if the leather might crumble beneath his fingers. As he flipped through, his lips drew into a thin line. "I believe there's something wrong," Emilia said quietly. "The entries near the end, they suggest that funds meant for the poor were being misused." Felton sighed and pushed the book gently away. "I will take care of it. That's all," she asked. "What more do you expect?" His voice remained polite, but it held the steel of finality. "The Duchess is dead. The accounts are closed. Let the dust lie where it settled. But if she knew, if she suspected someone in the household—" "Miss Marlowe," he interrupted, folding his hands. "You are here to read to Lady Margaret, not to disturb the memory of her mother. Do you understand what gossip can do to a child already in mourning?" His words were carefully chosen, weaponized with the decorum of men who wield power like parchment. "For the child's sake," he added, quieter. Emilia stood still for a long moment. "Yes," she whispered, "I understand." But understanding did not mean agreement. She walked back through the hallways of Renthorpe House like a woman underwater, each step heavy, each breath strained. The servants passed her in silence, their eyes lowered. Somewhere in the distance, the drawing-room clock struck the hour. That evening, Adrian did not appear, and the next day nor did he. Emilia noticed his absence in the quietest places, the absence of his boots outside the gallery, the untouched teacup in the study, the way Margaret looked toward the door during reading hour, her hands stilling on the page. By the third morning, Emilia caught sight of him in the garden, shoulders tense beneath his coat, his face turned toward the sky, as if trying to remember what warmth felt like. She said nothing. Because he said nothing, the truth had reached him. She knew it, and like a man bracing for floodwaters, he had chosen stillness over speech. The peace within Renthorpe fractured slowly, not with arguments, but with the space between people once drawn close. Margaret grew quieter again, her words fading into sighs. The staff spoke in briefer tones. Emilia's meals were served colder, and her name, spoken behind closed doors, gained weight. The town, too, sharpened its whispers. She overstepped. She snooped where she shouldn't have. Servants don't ask questions. The Duke has tired of her. Even her aunt sent a terse letter. "You've done enough damage. Come home while you still have a name." That night, Emilia packed her satchel in silence. She folded her dresses carefully, tucking each one between layers of parchment to keep them clean. She placed the pair of gloves she had worn to the winter gathering inside a small pouch. The book Margaret had once gifted her, pressed violets between its pages, remained unopened on the nightstand. She stood by the window for a long time. Rain tapped against the glass in patterns she could no longer decipher. She did not cry. She merely allowed the emptiness to settle in, as one allows dusk to fall without protest. A knock came at the door. Soft, hesitant. When she opened it, Margaret stood barefoot in her nightdress, a candle trembling in her hand. Her hair was undone, falling in golden ribbons down her back, her eyes wide not with sleepiness but with knowing. Emilia knelt before her. The child reached forward and placed a hand not on Emilia's shoulder, not on her cheek, but directly over her heart, and whispered, "Stay." It was not a request. It was a declaration. Emilia closed her eyes. Her heart cracked, not with pain, but with truth. She unpacked her satchel without another word, not because of affection for a man whose gaze she no longer understood, but because of a promise to a girl whose voice had been buried for too long, and because justice, once glimpsed, does not return to blindness. That night, the wind howled across the moors like a warning, but within the walls of Renthorpe, Emilia Marlowe stayed, not as a servant, not as a guest, but as someone who had chosen to see and could not unsee. Snow fell over Renthorpe House like sifted ash, soft, persistent, and strangely quiet. By late afternoon, the grounds were dressed in white, as though the earth itself wished to be made presentable for what was to come. The great iron gates stood open for the first time in nearly 2 years, flanked by lanterns whose flames flickered in defiance of the cold wind. Inside, the grand ballroom had been awakened from its long slumber. Chandeliers wept with crystal. Marble floors gleamed beneath the polish of hurried brushes. Musicians tuned strings near the gallery, while footmen moved like shadows, setting platters of sugared fruits and chilled punch along linen-draped tables. The house was no longer in mourning, but it had not yet learned how to rejoice. The Renthorpe Winter Ball had once been the crown jewel of the season, a gathering whispered about from Bath to Mayfair. The Duchess had presided over it with a smile carved from ice and roses, and her cousin, Lady Eugenia Sinclair, had always worn sapphires just to match her, though no one dared speak of that rivalry aloud. Now the Duchess was gone, and the ball, long delayed, had returned to a house trembling with things half buried. Adrian Blackthorne stood at the top of the staircase in full evening dress, black tailcoat with velvet lapels, white gloves, gold watch chain catching firelight as he adjusted his cuffs. His cravat was secured with a pin Emilia had never seen before, jet black with a single pearl, discreet and unassuming like the man who wore it. Guests arrived in clusters, greeted by murmured introductions and the rustle of silk. Emeralds sparkled, feathers danced, lace clung to shoulders too bare for winter. And beneath the spectacle, beneath the powdered faces and painted smiles, moved a current of expectation. Whispers clung to every wall. Would the Duke speak of the Duchess? Would his daughter appear? And, most shamefully uttered, would the reader be present? Emilia stood in the small room adjacent to the nursery, her heart beating too fast beneath the bodice of the gown she had spent 3 nights finishing. It was not satin or velvet. It did not shimmer. It did not sweep the floor with opulence. It was a modest blue wool, pressed until every pleat held its place, stitched with a hem of hand-embroidered ivy leaves, her own design. She had sewn it not to impress, but to belong. Just enough, no more. Her hands shook as she buttoned her cuffs. Her shoes were plain. Her hair, parted to the side, was coiled into a simple bun, fastened with a silver pin, shaped like a quill. She had not planned to descend, but Margaret had taken her hand earlier that day and said quite firmly, "Please come." And so she did. The room fell into an audible hush when she entered, not because of beauty, but because of disbelief. She did not lower her gaze. She walked with the same grace with which she moved through corridors and candlelit nurseries, and she stopped beside Margaret, who stood near the edge of the ballroom in a pale lilac dress with ribbons at her sleeves and a small braid tucked into her curls. Adrian crossed the room and stood beside them. He said nothing, but his presence alone was thunder. He looked at Emilia with a gaze steady and unreadable, then nodded to the musicians. The dance began. Emilia remained near the edge, watching as couples spun and turned, the rhythm of violins rising like wind through branches. She could feel the weight of a dozen stairs pressing against her back. Conversations stopped when she passed. A smile curdled here, a whisper there. She made that dress herself. Wool, of all things. It's a ball, not a harvest festival. I heard she found something in a book. She's clever, that one. Too clever. Just clever enough to be dangerous. Emilia found solace in Margaret's hand, in the way the child leaned against her with contentment rather than fear. And then, near the buffet table, she heard it. Two voices, one slurred with drink, the other hushed with unease. I tell you, it wasn't locked. Never was. She had the key all along. Keep your voice down, you fool! She used it that night. Don't think I didn't see. Said it was rusted, but it wasn't. That key gleamed, like she wanted it to be seen. Emilia turned her head slowly. The speaker was Cousin Alistair, red-faced and sweating, clutching a glass of brandy with trembling fingers. Beside him stood a footman she recognized, Peter, dismissed months ago under vague accusations of impropriety. He looked older now, hollower, but his eyes darted like those of a man cornered. What key? Peter whispered. Alistair swayed forward. The one she threw in the fire. But I saw where she kept the other, in that music box. The one with the swan on it. You remember? Peter's eyes widened. But Emilia was already moving. She slipped away without drawing attention, each step measured, her heart racing. Up the stairs, through the quiet corridor, past the servants who no longer looked her in the eye, into the nursery. The music box sat on the windowsill, half covered by a lace cloth. Carved from mahogany, its lid was inlaid with a mother-of-pearl swan, wings extended mid-flight. She lifted the lid. The tune chimed. Soft, wistful. Inside, nestled beneath velvet lining and a broken earring, was a brass key, small, ornate, untarnished. It gleamed in the dim light. Emilia reached for it with careful fingers, as though the metal itself might recoil. She turned it in her palm. The teeth of the key were unlike any she had seen used within the house's doors. The design was finer, older. Designed not for locks within a house, but perhaps beyond it. A door that opened outward. A gate. Snow tapped softly at the nursery window as she stared at the object in her hand, a chill rising from her spine, not from winter, but from memory. The ledger, the torn page, the circled entries. The Duchess had secrets, and someone had used them. Behind her, the music continued. Below, the ballroom spun in chandeliers and laughter. But here, in this quiet room above it all, Emilia felt the weight of something far heavier than silk or scandal, truth, waiting to be unlocked. The snow that blanketed Renthorpe in the days following the winter ball was not the gentle kind. It came sharp and steady, building drifts along the edge of the woods and muting even the distant whistle of the train that passed through the valley. The house stood hushed beneath its weight, the tall windows misted with frost, and the corridors lit with the glow of coal fires. But beneath the warmth, tension lingered. An invisible thread wound tight around every heartbeat. Emilia had kept the key hidden in the pocket of her cloak, wrapped in linen, close to her body like a secret that could dissolve if touched by air. For days she said nothing, watching the rhythm of the house with new eyes. Each passing glance, each paused footstep behind her in the hall, each murmur between servants took on a sharper edge. She had always listened carefully. Now she listened with purpose. She had not spoken to Adrian about what she had heard. Yet, his gaze had changed since the ball. There was a weight in it, not suspicion, but something heavier. A man trying to carry the crumbling edges of memory and duty at once. On the fifth morning, with the sky a silver wash above the hills, she found him in the conservatory, standing by the frost-glazed glass, his gloved hand resting on the edge of a table where winter roses bloomed out of season. "I need to show you something," she said quietly. He turned. There was no impatience in his face, no expectation, only quiet resolve. Perhaps he had known this moment was coming. Perhaps he too had been waiting. She withdrew the key from her cloak and held it out to him. He took it in silence. Emilia watched the way his eyes narrowed slightly, not with surprise but recognition, and when he spoke, it was with a voice stripped of all pretense. "That lock hasn't turned in years, not since the spring before the accident." Emilia nodded. "Would you come with me?" The path to the river gate wound along the back of the property, past the hedgerows, and through the remains of the old orchard, where twisted branches bore the ghosts of fruit. The snow reached their ankles. Adrian walked ahead, the long line of his coat cutting through the white, Emilia just behind, her breath rising in clouds. They reached the gate as the river's surface shimmered like pewter beneath a pale sun. The gate stood as it always had, tall, narrow wrought iron speckled with rust. The path beyond curved gently toward the stone footbridge, the one where Eliza Blackthorne had once been seen, only hours before her body was found downstream. Adrian took the key, and without ceremony inserted it into the old lock. It turned with a soft, clean click, no effort, no resistance, as if it had always waited for this moment. He stepped back, slowly. Emilia stared at the gate, her gloved hand pressed to her mouth. Her chest ached with a truth that had not yet fully taken shape. "She said she was leaving," Adrian said, his voice raw. "The night before. She'd grown restless, furious even. Accused me of burying myself in the estate. Claimed I only kept her in the house to protect the family name." He looked at Emilia then, and she saw it in his face. The years he had buried under control, the guilt that had woven itself into his every breath. "She said she would take Margaret," he continued, "that I didn't deserve her. I thought she was angry, grieving. I let her go to her room. I didn't follow." Emilia's voice barely rose above the wind. "She didn't plan to drown, did she?" He shook his head slowly. "No." They stood in silence, facing the open gate and the path that curved out of sight. "She was led there," Emilia whispered, "by someone who knew she'd follow." He turned to her. "And someone who had a reason to want her gone." The words remained unspoken, but their meaning hung heavy between them. Someone inside the house, someone with access, someone who would benefit from her silence. That night, the dining room remained unused. Adrian took supper in his study, and Emilia returned to the nursery, where Margaret lay curled on the settee, her cheeks flushed with sleep and a book tucked beneath her chin. Mrs. Havers entered quietly, carrying fresh linen and the child's nightgown. She set them down, then lingered by the fire. "I remember the night she died," she said suddenly. Emilia looked up. "She wasn't herself," the housekeeper continued, her voice steady but distant. Something had shifted in her eyes. Fear, I think. Or knowledge. "Why didn't you say anything?" Emilia asked softly. Mrs. Havers sat slowly on the edge of the nursery armchair, her hands folded. "Because I've seen what happens to women who say too much, to girls who rise above their place. I didn't think anyone would believe me. And the child," she glanced at Margaret, "had already lost so much. You believe it wasn't an accident?" "I believe someone helped her disappear. Whether by design or by silence, I can't say." But that night I saw a man pacing near the garden wall, too tall to be one of the footmen, too still to be a guest. Did you recognize him? Mrs. Havers hesitated. Not clearly, but I remember the glint of his ring, a family crest. Blackthorn? Emilia whispered. The housekeeper gave a slow nod. There are few who wear it, and fewer still who would dare. When Emilia left the nursery, the candlelight of the corridor seemed dimmer, the shadows longer. The portraits along the walls no longer looked merely stern. They looked watchful. She paused before the empty space where the Duchess's likeness had once hung, the bare panel behind it revealing cracks in the plaster, the hidden fractures beneath beauty. She placed her hand to the wall and felt the house hold its breath. The next morning, the frost on the garden wall had melted slightly under the weight of the sun, but Renthorpe had grown colder. Within its walls now lived a name, a face, perhaps, and the first trace of betrayal, not from a stranger, but from someone meant to protect. The wind had shifted. It no longer whispered, but pressed hard against the windows of Renthorpe House, as if demanding entry. The hearths burned hotter, curtains were drawn tighter, and yet no warmth could banish the chill that had begun to creep through its corridors, not from the winter beyond, but from the truth that stirred within its walls. Emilia had not slept, not truly. Her mind had become a ledger of questions and names, of torn pages and unfinished thoughts. The brooch, the one Eliza Blackthorne had worn every day like a shield, had vanished after her death. Adrian had searched for it in the days that followed and found nothing. And yet Mrs. Havers, ever watchful, had once remarked in passing that the piece had not been among the Duchess's effects, nor listed in the probate records, a detail easy to dismiss. Until now. That morning, Emilia made her way down to the village. She said nothing to Adrian, only that she would return before dusk. He had looked at her for a long moment, as if wanting to ask what she carried beneath her cloak. But he only nodded, and the silence between them felt like a contract. The pawnshop stood in a crooked alley, its windows fogged and its sign half swinging in the wind. It smelled of dust, tobacco, and the resignation of forgotten things. Emilia stepped inside, removing her gloves with calm purpose. The shopkeeper, a thin man with a patchy beard and ink-stained fingers, barely looked up. "Help you?" he grunted. Emilia placed a folded note on the counter, a sketch she had copied by candlelight the night before, of the Duchess's brooch, oval gold filigree with a sapphire centre shaped like a teardrop and tiny pearls bordering the edge. "I'm searching for this," she said. "It was pawned last winter." He squinted at it, then gave a half-laugh. "We see 100 baubles a month, miss. Can't say I—" But then he paused. He bent closer. Emilia watched the shift in his features, the brief flicker of recognition, quickly masked. "You've seen it," she said, her voice calm but sharp. He looked up. "Even if I had, I wouldn't discuss a client's business." She placed a coin on the table, then another, and then a name. Eliza Blackthorne. That silenced him. After a long pause, he drew a small ledger from beneath the counter and flipped through pages yellowed and curling. His finger stopped. "1 year ago last week," he muttered. "Brought in by a gentleman. Claimed it belonged to his sister. Said he was settling family debts. I didn't ask questions." Emilia's heart tightened. "Do you recall his name?" "Didn't give one, but—" He tapped the margin. "Signed with a mark. Looked like a family crest. Thistle and stag. The Blackthorne seal." There was no doubt now. She thanked him, left a second coin, and stepped out into the cold. Snow flurried sideways as she returned up the hill, but her limbs burned with purpose. The weight of the brooch's absence had become a voice, and it was calling names. When she returned to Renthorpe, Adrian was in the study, bent over a map of the estate. He looked up as she entered, and something in his eyes shifted. "You found something," he said. Emilia nodded, removing her cloak, her voice low and steady. "The brooch was pawned, the same night she died, by a man using your family's seal." He went still. Who? She hesitated. We must speak with Mr. Felton. The solicitor arrived that evening. Candlelight trembled in the study as he sat across from them, his fingers nervous on the brim of his hat. I asked you once, Emilia began gently, what was missing from the Duchess's accounts. Felton exhaled. I told you nothing, because I feared what the truth might do to this household. But now, he opened his briefcase, withdrew a bundle of correspondence tied with faded green ribbon. These letters were intercepted by request, he said. Sent to Lady Eliza by someone inside the family. She never received them. I was told to destroy them. I did not. He passed the bundle to Adrian. The Duke untied the ribbon, hands steady despite the shadows creeping into his gaze. Each letter bore the same hand, curt, unapologetic, requests for funds, veiled threats, hints at family disgrace if debts were not covered. The signature, E. Blackthorne. Edward, Adrian said, his voice a bitter murmur. Emilia watched him close the final letter with the careful hand of a man sealing a wound. I should have seen it, he said. He was always just close enough, just useful enough. He blamed me for the inheritance. Felton cleared his throat. And he stood to gain much more if you were ruined. Adrian looked at Emilia, and Margaret, she would have been removed eventually, Emilia said, to protect her from scandal. It was enough. That night, Adrian sent for his cousin. Edward Blackthorne arrived with snow still clinging to his coat sleeves, his expression curious, almost amused. He entered the study with the gait of a man who had never once imagined being questioned. You summoned me like a butler, he said, shrugging out of his coat. Shall I expect to be offered tea or a confession? Adrian did not rise. Sit. Edward raised a brow but obeyed. Emilia stood near the window, hands folded. Adrian slid the bundle of letters across the desk. Edward glanced at them, then back up. You've been rifling through the past. Dangerous pastime. They're your words, Adrian said coldly. To Eliza. Threats. Demands. Edward's smile wavered. Old wounds. Nothing more. Adrian stood slowly. You pawned her brooch the night she died. I have witness and record. For the first time, Edward faltered. You opened the gate. Edward's eyes narrowed. You think I pushed her into the river? I think, Adrian said, voice breaking, you led her there with fear, with shame, and when she turned back the path had disappeared. Edward looked away. Adrian stepped forward. I'm not asking as your cousin, not as a duke. I'm asking as a father. Tell me the truth. Let me bury her with it. Silence. Then Edward's shoulders sagged. I never meant for her to die. The words dropped like stone into water. I wanted her to leave, to disgrace herself, so you'd be forced to step down, so the estate would pass to me eventually. I couldn't stand her, the way she looked at me, like I was a stray. He looked up. I only wanted ruin, Adrian, not death. And yet you vanished when it came. Edward stood, brushing snow from his cuffs. So what now? Public scandal? Arrest? No, Adrian said quietly, but you will leave this house tonight. You will never speak of this to anyone, and you will never look upon Margaret again. Edward laughed bitterly. The girl's stronger than you think. She is stronger because of those she's lost, Emilia said softly. Edward glanced at her for the first time. You, he murmured, almost with curiosity. You're the reason he sees clearly now. And then he was gone. The house did not breathe until the front door closed. Adrian sat again, his hand trembling for the first time. She trusted him, he whispered, and he destroyed her. Emilia stepped forward. She loved you. That's why she didn't leave. The clock struck the hour. Outside, the snow fell once more. Inside, betrayal had been named, and with it, the long shadow cast across Renthorpe began to recede. But in its place stood grief and the beginning of reckoning. Christmas came to Renthorpe House not with fanfare, but with the soft insistence of snow that fell without pause for 2 whole days, coating the world in quiet forgiveness. The chimneys sent up ribbons of smoke that drifted lazily into the grey sky, and the air smelled faintly of pine, candle wax, and the promise of something healed. For the first time in years, laughter, real, unguarded laughter, rose from the kitchen below stairs. The house that had long resisted joy now seemed to exhale, as though finally remembering what it meant to be alive. Emilia stood by the parlour window, her breath misting the glass, watching flakes dissolve against the warmth of the pane. Her gown was modest, pale grey trimmed with lace she had mended herself, but in the amber glow of the fire it shimmered faintly, softening the lines of her face. Her hair, swept up in a loose knot, held a single sprig of holly tucked just behind her ear, placed there by Margaret earlier that afternoon. She smiled at the thought. The child, once voiceless and withdrawn, now hummed quietly in the next room as she arranged small pine cones along the mantel. Behind Emilia, the great clock chimed the hour. Guests would arrive soon. The invitation had been small and unpretentious. Close friends, a few neighbours, and the vicar who had baptised Margaret years ago. Still, the very act of opening Renthorpe's doors to the world again was an act of courage, one that bore the quiet signature of Adrian Blackthorne. He entered the room as the clock's final chime faded, his presence as steady as the hearthlight. His attire was simple for a duke, a dark coat, waistcoat of muted blue, no cravat pin, no ostentation. Yet he carried an air of gravity that drew all light toward him. Emilia turned slightly as he approached, her eyes lifting in quiet acknowledgement. "It feels different tonight," she said. "Not quieter, but easier to breathe." He looked toward the fire. Perhaps the walls have learned to listen. Their eyes met briefly, and something unspoken passed between them. Something neither dared name. The months of silence, discovery, and heartbreak had built a bridge between them that neither ceremony nor distance could undo. Still they stood apart, as decorum required, the air between them alive with unspoken tenderness. Margaret entered then, her cheeks flushed, her small hands clutching a worn copy of Grimm's Tales, the same book Emilia had first read to her by the nursery fire. She placed it carefully on the table beside Emilia and looked up at her father. "Will there be music, Papa?" she asked. Her voice, now full and certain, still carried the fragile sweetness of a miracle newly born. Adrian smiled faintly. "If the guests wish it." "I do," Margaret said, with a quiet confidence that made Emilia's throat tighten. The evening began as softly as the snow outside. Candles burned low in their holders, wreaths of evergreen framed the windows, and the drawing room filled with the gentle murmur of conversation. Emilia took her place near the hearth, reading aloud as Margaret sat curled beside her on a small upholstered stool. Her voice wove through the room like a thread of gold, steady, warm, wrapping even the coldest hearts in its rhythm. Adrian stood near the mantelpiece, speaking little, but his eyes rarely left the sight of the two of them together, the woman who had restored his home's pulse and the daughter who now held his hand without fear. When the reading ended, there was a pause, a comfortable one. The guests, among them Lady Sinclair, the vicar, and Mr. Felton, watched Emilia close the book with the grace of a benediction. And then, unexpectedly, Adrian stepped forward. He did not raise his voice, yet it filled the room with quiet command. "There are truths," he began, "that a man spends years learning how to face. Some are private, meant only for memory. Others belong to the living, and silence, though it may protect for a time, can also destroy." All eyes turned to him. The firelight carved deep shadows across his face, emphasizing the sharp lines of resolve. Emilia sat very still, her hands clasped in her lap. "For too long," Adrian continued, "this house carried the weight of misunderstanding, mine most of all. My wife, Lady Eliza Blackthorne, was not the woman rumour made her, nor was her death the fault of folly or madness, as the world was content to believe." A murmur rippled through the room. Lady Sinclair's fan stilled. Adrian's gaze did not waver. She was misled, deceived by one she trusted, and when she sought to make right what had been wrong, She paid the highest price. He paused, the silence taut as wire. My cousin, Lord Edward Blackthorne, acted out of envy and pride. His hand did not take her life, but his deception led her to ruin. That truth will be made public in due time, and his name, though bound by blood to mine, will no longer darken this household. The guests shifted uneasily, their faces reflecting the gravity of the revelation. Yet Adrian's tone remained measured, unwavering. I owe my wife this truth, he said, and I owe this house the freedom of it. The shame belongs not to the dead, but to the living who profit by their silence. He turned then toward Emilia. And to Miss Marlowe, I owe gratitude. She has endured scorn in my service and suspicion under my roof, yet she has restored what grief and deceit had taken, dignity, honesty, and the voice of a child who no longer hides behind silence. For a moment no one moved. The only sound was the steady hiss of snow melting against the window panes. Then softly the vicar spoke. Truth is a rare gift, Your Grace. Most fear to give it, and more fear to receive it. Adrian inclined his head in thanks. This house has known too much fear. It is time it knew grace. The words lingered in the air long after the fire had settled into embers. Emilia felt tears well in her eyes, though she blinked them back quickly. Across the room, Lady Sinclair bowed her head slightly, chastened. Mr. Felton, his expression weary but sincere, gave a subtle nod of respect. Margaret's small voice broke the hush. Papa, she said, standing now beside the chair where Emilia sat, can she read the ending? Adrian looked down at his daughter, his composure trembling at the edges. Yes, he said softly. She may. Emilia opened the book once more, her hands trembling slightly as she found the final page. Her voice, steady but full of emotion, carried the tale's closing words through the room, a story of loss, of courage, and of light returning after a long winter. When she finished, she closed the book gently and looked up. No one spoke, but there, in the quiet that followed, something sacred moved through the air. Margaret climbed into her father's lap, wrapping her small arms around his neck. Adrian pressed a kiss to her hair, his eyes never leaving Emilia's. The firelight flickered between them, warm, steady, alive. The evening wound down in subdued warmth. Guests whispered farewells, coats were gathered, and carriages rolled out into the snow. The vicar offered his blessing at the door. When at last the house emptied, the silence that remained was different from the one that had haunted Renthorpe for so long. This silence was peace, earned and deep. Emilia remained by the hearth, as Adrian saw the final guests away. When he returned, his steps were unhurried, the weight of years lifted from his shoulders. Margaret had already been carried to bed by Mrs. Havers, her sleep easy and untroubled. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. You were right, he said finally, his voice low. The house breathes again. Emilia turned to him, her eyes glistening in the firelight. It was never the house that needed air, Your Grace, only the hearts inside it. He smiled faintly, almost as if the name she still used wounded him in ways he welcomed. Then we are free, he said. Her lips parted to answer, but the words caught in her throat. There was nothing more to say. Outside, the snow continued to fall, thick and endless, cloaking the garden paths, the iron gate, the river that once carried sorrow downstream. Renthorpe House stood tall against the night, no longer in mourning, no longer afraid. And in the drawing-room, where truth had been spoken and grace restored, two souls stood within arm's reach of something they could not yet name, something fragile, human, and incandescent as the snow that kept falling, whispering against the windows of a house finally at peace. The snow began to melt in the first week of January, retreating like a curtain drawn back after a long performance. Renthorpe House, once grey and hushed beneath the weight of its sorrow, now breathed with a quiet vitality. The hedges stood tall and green once more, the conservatory windows fogged not with cold, but with the warmth of seedlings growing under careful hands. Even the household staff, once ghost-like in their steps, now moved with purpose. Doors opened briskly, Coal fires crackled with welcome, and the sound of a child's laughter echoed freely through the halls. Margaret danced through the corridors in her wool slippers, reading aloud to her governess, or humming the lullabies Emilia had once whispered to her by candlelight. Her words, once locked behind grief, now spilled like pearls from her mouth, gentle, curious, and bright. The transformation was not miraculous, but earned. Emilia had given her more than language. She had given her safety, truth, and the grace of being heard. And now Emilia stood at her own threshold, hands folded over a letter from her cousin, the one who still lived with their bitter aunt in the outskirts of the city. The handwriting was awkward and smudged, but full of affection. News of her recovery, of better days ahead, and thanks for the money Emilia had quietly sent each month from her wages. That duty too had been fulfilled. Her trunk sat neatly packed in the corner of her chamber. The dresses she had stitched with care were folded with lavender, the few books she owned wrapped in muslin. There was no ceremony to her leaving. No one had told her to go, but neither had they asked her to stay. She had come to Renthorpe as a servant, and now, with the scandal resolved and the child thriving, it was time to go with dignity intact. But something was not as it should have been. When she turned back to the bed to gather her bonnet, she saw it. Laid across the coverlet, as though left there by unseen hands, was a gown of deep navy silk, trimmed in midnight velvet. The fabric caught the morning light and shimmered like still water beneath a starless sky. The bodice was cut with elegant restraint, the sleeves long and tapered, the hem slightly sweeping. There was no monogram, no symbol of rank, only the quiet confidence of beauty made for someone seen. Emilia touched the fabric with hesitant fingers. It was finer than anything she had worn in her life, yet it bore none of the gaudiness of borrowed luxury. It had not been made for display. It had been made for her. The knock at the door came softly. She turned. Adrian stood there, not in ceremonial dress but in his usual charcoal coat and waistcoat, his expression quiet. His eyes swept the room and landed on the gown before returning to her face. "You weren't meant to find it so soon," he said, his voice low. Emilia's heart beat once, hard. "I was packing," she answered simply. "My work here is done." He stepped inside, closing the door gently behind him. The space felt smaller with him in it, not for lack of room, but because his presence occupied something beyond space. He didn't move toward her, not at once. Instead, he looked around the room where she had spent the better part of a year. The windowsill where she sat to read, the sewing basket by the hearth, the chair Margaret had dragged in from the nursery. "It's strange," he murmured. "How much of someone can remain in a place, even after she's gone?" Emilia did not answer. She dared not. Adrian stepped closer, his eyes fixed on hers now. "I thought this house would always echo with ghosts, that no matter what we tried, we would live under the weight of silence. But it was never the house that was haunted. It was me." His voice trembled slightly, but he did not look away. "You reminded me what it means to trust, to speak, to hope. You didn't force the shadows to lift. You simply stayed long enough that the light remembered how to reach us." Emilia tried to speak, but the words caught in her throat. He saw it and waited, not pressing, not demanding. At last, she found her voice. "I wasn't supposed to stay. I was never meant to belong here." He took another step. "Then why does this house fall silent without you?" The room held its breath. "I won't ask you as a duke asking a governess," he said, softer now. "I won't ask you as a man clinging to what's convenient. I'm asking you as someone who has healed beside you, who has watched his daughter bloom because of you. I'm asking you, Emilia, if you will stay, not in service, but in choice. Will you build a life here with me? Not as someone beneath me, but beside me." Tears welled in her eyes, not from sorrow, but from the staggering tenderness of being chosen. Not claimed, not rewarded, simply seen. She nodded, slowly. "Then surely—" "Yes," she whispered, "I will." The ceremony, held a fortnight later, was small by noble standards, but to those present it felt like the coronation of something deeper than status. The drawing room had been rearranged for the occasion. Margaret wore a pale blue sash and carried the same book of tales that had once taught her how to speak again. Mrs. Havers stood stiffly by the mantel, dabbing her eyes when she thought no one saw. The vicar spoke softly, blessing the union not with pomp, but with reverence. Emilia wore the navy silk gown. Her hair was arranged in a simple twist, her only adornment a gold chain Adrian had given her the evening before, bearing no crest, only a locket containing a pressed wildflower from the Renthorpe garden. She stood tall, her hand in Adrian's, not trembling. The words were spoken, the promise sealed. No crowds cheered, no headlines screamed. But in the stillness of that moment, history shifted. Not the history of England, but of one house, one man, one woman, and the child whose voice had returned because love, once offered quietly, had not been refused. In the weeks that followed, life did not become fairy tale. There were still letters to write, estates to manage, reputations to defend, but laughter grew more common than whispers. Music returned to the parlour. The servants smiled more freely. Margaret's drawings now adorned the hallway outside the nursery, and Emilia's name was spoken without caution. She no longer mended torn gowns or inked ledgers, but her hands had not forgotten how to make things whole. She wrote now, letters, journals, new stories for Margaret. She taught a reading circle in the village once a week and welcomed the young girls of the tenant families into the kitchen for lessons. And each night, as the lamps were lit and the doors drawn closed, Adrian would find her, sometimes in the library, sometimes on the garden bench beneath the stars, and he would sit beside her, no title between them, only breath, only belonging. In time, the world forgot to mock the girl who had saved a duke, but those who mattered remembered. They remembered how a seamstress had stitched together more than torn hems. She had stitched a home back together, thread by thread, word by word. And so it was that Emilia Marlowe, now Duchess of Renthorpe, stood not above the people she once walked among, but with them. A woman of ink-stained fingers and a velvet heart, of courage quiet as snow, who proved once and for all that dignity is not bestowed by blood, but forged in love, truth, and the refusal to look away. That winter the snow fell again, gentle, constant, and bright. But Renthorpe no longer mourned beneath it. It danced. The winter of 1891 arrived not with the fury of ice, but with a quiet grace that blanketed the hills of Yorkshire in gentle white. Renthorpe House stood unchanged in structure, its stone walls weathered but proud. Yet within, it had transformed utterly. Gone were the heavy silences and corridors of shadows. In their place lived warmth, rhythm, and a kind of happiness, not loud or gaudy, but deep-rooted and true. 8 years had passed since Emilia Marlowe had married the Duke of Renthorpe, and in that time love had not dulled, it had deepened. It had folded itself into the fabric of daily life, in the steam curling from tea poured at sunrise, in the ink-stained fingertips of letters read together at dusk, in the soft murmur of laughter when small hands grasped theirs in the nursery. There were now 2 children who bore the Blackthorn name. George, aged 6, was a solemn boy with his mother's watchful eyes and his father's stillness. He listened more than he spoke, preferring books to games and always asking what words meant. Clara, barely 4, was all fire and curiosity. She had Margaret's dimples and Emilia's resilience. She ran through the halls like a storm in lace boots, carrying tales and bruises with equal pride. And Margaret, now 16, had grown into a poised and fiercely intelligent young woman, her voice steady, her gaze unwavering. She rode out alone on horseback, translated Latin for fun, and had begun speaking of universities, though always with a glance at her father, gauging whether the world might yet bend enough to let her in. She had not spoken a word until Emilia came into her life, and now she was writing essays on reform and organizing petitions for schools in the village. Love, it seemed, had not merely endured, it had multiplied. Emilia stood at the window that overlooked the garden, her hands clasped loosely before her, watching George and Clara build uneven snowmen while Margaret sketched them from a bench. The old ornamental bridge still arched across the river, but the path that once led to sorrow had been rerouted. The gate by the water had been sealed, not with nails, but with ivy. Nature had reclaimed what memory had once cursed. Adrian entered without sound, as he often did, and stood behind her. His hair was more silver than black now, but his presence remained steady, unchanged in essence. "They've made a rather lopsided family," he said, nodding toward the snowmen. "They take after us, then," Emilia replied with a small smile. He reached for her hand and lifted it to his lips. "Do you ever wonder," he asked quietly, "what would have become of us if that carriage had not overturned?" "I try not to," she answered honestly, "because I fear I might have survived the world, but never lived in it." He wrapped his arm around her, drawing her gently against him. There were still those who whispered, quiet remnants of a class that clung to lineage like a life raft. But they were fewer now. The scandal that once threatened to define them had become no more than a faded headline in the back pages of history. Lord Edward had lived out the last of his days abroad, stripped of title and fortune, never to set foot again in the country he once tried to claim through treachery. His letters, when they came, were bitter. His name was no longer spoken in the drawing room. Mrs. Havers had retired 2 winters ago. She now lived in a small cottage at the edge of the estate, her knees stiff but her mind as sharp as ever. Margaret visited her weekly, and the two played chess by firelight and argued over the ethics of Byron versus Shelley. The village had changed too. The old mill had been converted into a schoolhouse, funded quietly by the Duchess's foundation, a fund born from those long-forgotten ledgers Emilia had once uncovered. More girls now attended than boys, and no one dared question it. Emilia herself had become more than a duchess. She had become a symbol, not of rebellion, but of dignity, the kind earned, not inherited. Young women from London wrote to her for advice. Seamstresses still sent samples stitched with the initials E.M., as if by touching her name they might be seen as she had once hoped to be. And yet, for all her grace and quiet power, Emilia remained rooted in the small, true things. She still sewed when the children tore their coats. She still read to Margaret at night, though now they traded roles. She still walked the gardens alone in the early mornings, remembering who she had been, an orphan, a girl mocked in the papers, a woman uninvited into rooms where she now sat at the head of the table. That evening, snow fell again. It coated the windows, drifted along the hedgerows, softened the corners of the world. After supper, Clara climbed into Emilia's lap with a book too large for her hands. Margaret took the chair by the fire, and George perched cross-legged on the floor, elbows on knees, eyes fixed on his mother. Adrian poured 2 glasses of port, handed one to Emilia, and remained standing, watching them, not with the heaviness of grief as he once had, but with the still, stunned gratitude of a man who had nearly lost everything before he even realized he wanted it. "Shall I read it again?" Emilia asked the children. "Please," Clara whispered, eyes round. "It's the ending we love," George added. Emilia opened the book to the final page, one she had repaired years ago with careful stitches across the torn binding. Her voice, steady and rich, filled the room. And so, though the wind howled and the snow fell, they stayed where the fire was warm, the hearts were braver, and love had not left them even once. She closed the book, slowly. Outside, the wind sighed against the window panes. Inside, Renthorpe House glowed. And in the hush that followed, Margaret, now taller than her mother, stood, crossed the room and placed a kiss on Emilia's cheek. "You didn't just stay," she whispered. "You saved us all." Emilia smiled. Her hands no longer bore ink or thread, but they had rewritten a man, a child, a house, and perhaps in some small way, the world. And that winter, as 8 years before, the snow did not mourn. It blessed. Every story leaves something behind. And this one, of courage born in silence, of dignity stitched in the shadows, of love discovered not in grand gestures but in quiet daily acts, reminds us of a truth far deeper than romance alone. Emilia Marlowe did not change the world with riches or power. She changed it by staying, by listening, by choosing truth when silence would have been easier. And in doing so, she showed us that no matter where we come from, whether a modest attic room or the drawing rooms of dukes, our worth is not given by birth, but revealed through love, kindness, and quiet strength. Perhaps you too have stood in a room where you weren't expected. Perhaps you've been judged for where you came from, or told that you shouldn't hope for more. Let this story be your reminder that grace belongs to those who walk with integrity, that it is never foolish to love, never weak to speak, and never too late to be seen. If this journey moved you, if it lingered in your chest or made you whisper "stay" under your breath, let us know. Tell us in the comments how this story touched you. And if you made it all the way to the end, write the word "stitched" below. That one word will tell us you were here, feeling every glance, every silence, every snowfall with us. If you'd like to support the team that pours heart and soul into crafting these timeless tales, you can click Super Thanks right here on YouTube. Any amount you wish to give helps us continue to bring these emotional journeys to life. But if today you can't contribute financially, there's still a powerful way to help. Share this story with someone who cherishes romance, resilience, and the kind of love that heals. And when you're ready for more, we've left other unforgettable stories for you in the video cards above. Tales of secret letters, forbidden dances, and second chances that arrive just when hope is fading. Thank you for being part of this story. Thank you for staying.